Okay, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am joined once again by Dr. Daniel Vecchio and Suan Sonna. It's been a minute since I've had either of you on the podcast. I think we did have both of you together like a number of years ago. So it's great to have the band back together. Interesting conversation today. We're going to be talking about the death penalty, particularly as the debate has been going on among Catholics. This is an interesting and super controversial topic. Each of us has sort of chimed in different ways to this in various places. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to help Catholics. If you're not Catholic, you'll still probably find this interesting, but if you are a Catholic, please pay attention to this episode. Our goal is to help people to think intelligently about this issue and to contextualize it and to help them understand that the question about the death penalty, whether it is morally permissible or whether it's intrinsically evil, for Catholics, is an issue that is much larger than just that question. It really pertains to the whole credibility of the teaching organ of the Catholic Church, of the Catholic magisterium itself. So I'll forgo the introductions. You guys have been on the podcast enough times. I think I just kind of want to get to the meat of it. And what I would like to do is just sort of lay out some preliminaries. I had a Substack that got a decent amount of attention not too long ago. It was called something obnoxious, like the Intelligent Catholic's Guide to the Death Penalty Debate or something like that. And my goal here was to help Catholics to see what the possible options, not just logically possible, but plausible options were for where they could land on the death penalty debate. So I'm going to use that as a sort of launch pad. Then I want to, Suan and Daniel, have you two talk about a recent response to Suan, actually, from Dr. Ed Fazer, who's been a prominent voice in this debate. And then I want you two to set forth the position I think you two have been working on. I think you two have been kind of trying to develop a position on this issue that might present a resolution that might be somewhat novel. And I'm excited to hear it. I have no idea what it is, so it'll be totally news to me. Do either of you have anything you want to say right away, or should we just keep going?
No, I think we can keep going.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So let me set the stage for this. I mean, the death penalty is an interesting moral question in general, right? Is it just? Is it morally permissible? Is it intrinsically evil? Is it something that could never be permissible under any circumstances, or are there certain circumstances where it could be permissible? The reason this matters for Catholics is that there is an apparent, I say, change in what the church says about this issue. And I'm just going to use the word apparent a lot here because the history is not something that I'm a total subject matter expert in. So I'll let you guys clean up any mess that I may make. But the apparent traditional teaching on the death penalty, it seems that was pretty much universally accepted by the church fathers and taught by the church, was that even if the death penalty, and there was disagreement about whether it should actually be exercised, was that it was at least morally licit, right? That it was at least morally licit. You have statements from various popes. Ed Fazer produces an impressive number of receipts here, even going so far as to claim that it is heterodox to say that it is not morally licit. So it seems like that the church for a very long time taught at a very high level of authority, and certain thinkers like Fazer would say at an irreformable level of authority, that the death penalty, even if we decide for whatever reason that it should not be used in whatever circumstances, was at least morally licit. And somewhat recently, particularly beginning with Pope Francis, and now it seems with Pope Leo, that is maybe not the case anymore, right? And I say maybe because this is part of the conversation. There was a change to the catechism, which says that the word used is that the death penalty is inadmissible, right? And that has been a very funny word that people have spilled a lot of ink over, of trying to understand what does inadmissible mean. But then there were further statements, particularly by Pope Francis, which made even stronger claims that it is, always a violation of human dignity and is it just can't be used under any circumstances. It's always a violation of human dignity under any circumstances whatsoever. Okay, so why is this an issue? Well, it's an issue not just because it just seems to be a flip on an important question, but the Catholic Church, one of her core claims is a claim to indefectibility, that there are certain things within certain boundaries that once they are taught at a certain level of authority, cannot possibly change, right? They just cannot. This is the core claim of indefectibility, which extends to papal infallibility, right? Suan has done a lot of excellent work on this, right? So at the extreme end of this, if the church says, that X will never happen in her infallible mode, let's say, and then X does happen, I mean, that's a falsification event. That's what that is, right? So the stakes here are very high and real insofar as if it is the case that the church once taught at a sufficiently high level of authority that the death penalty was morally illicit, and now she's teaching at an equal level of authority that it is, it seems we have an event that spells like doom for the core claim of Catholicism. Now, none of us want to say that has happened, right? But this is obviously a major concern that has been raised. So what I did in the Substack is I tried to lay out options for Catholics to think about this issue, and first to understand what the stakes actually are and why this debate matters, and that people who are concerned about this, and I think this is just a matter of charity, they're not like pro capital punishment because they've got bloodlust, and they just can't wait to get to the next public execution or something like that. It's really a concern and a deep love for the faith and the teaching credibility of the faith and the credibility of Catholicism, not just internally, but how other people perceive it as well, right? And wanting to avoid scandal and confusion, and those are all good concerns, right? It's not just some inherent desire to dissent either or something like that. So I outline in the Substack, I'm going from memory here, so I might be skipping a few things. I say, look, there's really two positions you could hold. You could hold an incompatibility thesis or a compatibility thesis. And this is, as the names imply, an incompatibility thesis would say that, yeah, what was taught before is incompatible with what is being taught now, right? And then you have a compatibility thesis, which is to say, actually, if we understand things right, what was taught before is not incompatible with what was taught now, right? And assuming that one wants to avoid this sort of falsification event, then under the incompatibility thesis, you really have two options, right? You either have to say that the prior teaching was incorrect, right? But the current teaching is correct. But the prior teaching was just not taught at the level where it was irreformable, right? That's option one, okay? The option two is just the reverse, obviously, right? That the prior teaching was correct, the current teaching is incorrect, but it's not taught at the level where it is irreformable, infallible, whatever. It doesn't fit within the restrictions that surround indefectible or infallible pronouncements or something like that, right? So, and then I outline what I think are the costs. And look, the way I position my Substack is I don't really see like a totally cost-free option here. I think there's costs to all of these options. And cards on the table, I'm quite sympathetic with Ed Fazer's read on all this stuff. I think he has had a lot of intelligent things to say about this. And I think the cost for taking that first option under the incompatibility thesis is very high. Very high indeed. Like, even if you say it never quite reached the level of an irreformable teaching, I think that's hard to do because, I mean, man, then you would have to say, I think a lot of things that meet similar conditions wouldn't have reached that level, which I think is a cost. But the thing about capital punishment is I think it would be uniquely scandalous, right? If what was traditionally taught was wrong, not just because it was taught for so long and at such a high level, but the church really had a hand in sort of carrying it out, right? I mean, there were papal executioners, right? I mean, one famous account, the guy had 514 documented executions. And it's like, to me, this would be like the church got the matter of abortion wrong, taught it at a really high level, and had papal abortionists. Now, look, there's been lots of scandals in the church before, but I can't really think of a parallel where the church was promoting as a good or as a potential good scandalous activity and doled it out, right? Like, yeah, there was instances of torture and cruelty, maybe even for the sake of conversion, but conversion itself is a good. And the church never taught that cruelty was a good, for example. So like bad things happen, nobody denies that, or indulgences abused, but abuse does not negate proper use. So like, I think it would be uniquely scandalous is what I'm saying, is even if it wasn't at an irreformable level, for something that is intrinsically evil to be taught for that long at that high of a level and actively carried out by a church would be uniquely scandalous and problematic. So I'm not inclined to go in that position for those reasons, but maybe that is a position that's on the table. The other one under the incompatibility thesis is just to say that the present teaching is incorrect, at least at a certain level. And I think this is still a cost because it's never great if you have any level of teaching from the Pope, even not an infallible one, or that's just is not well formulated or accurate. That itself is scandalous, and that's detrimental. I think it's less costly than the other option, but it's still an option one could take, right? The compatibility thesis, I'll try and speed along here, is to simply read the present revisions, and this is just one option I give. I think you guys might have another one that you're going to present here as not teaching that the death penalty is intrinsically evil, but that for as a matter of prudence, it's a prudential judgment, it should not be used. It's off the table, so to speak, in the present situation, because whatever conditions you want to spell out, right? And we don't even have to get into what those conditions are. It's enough just to say that, okay, if this is just a prudential decision, and you might even think it's not a great prudential decision, then it's at least not necessarily incompatible with the prior teachings of it being at least permissible in principle, if that makes sense, right? And this is a position a lot of people have wanted to take. They've wanted to say, okay, we can harmonize these things, but we do have to read the current, more recent statements, particularly the Catechism one, and that funny word admissible as a prudential decision. I think there are costs to this too, and Phaser has pointed this out. I think it is sort of a strained reading. It's not the natural reading of the Catechism to read that way, but if you're using a principle of charity and you need to read things in a certain light to harmonize them, then that's maybe just a read you have to take. But then I also do think when you look at those further statements from Pope Francis, I still think that there's a level that you have to accept a certain incompatibility. You have to say that those are just badly formulated, incorrect, or something like that. So I think maybe you don't escape incompatibility completely. All right, I've gone on for longer than I intended to or wanted to, but was that helpful, guys? Is at least the table of options clear? Do you like that framing? Do you think that's fair? Is there anything missing? Please chime in now. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I guess I'll just say that I think that is a good lay of the land, and what I'm hoping to advance, and in conjunction and amplified, I think, by Suan's theological take, is to go towards a different way of looking at the compatibility thesis, one that you haven't articulated, that I think what I would say hasn't really been strongly articulated by the current magisterium, but isn't novel in the sense that it's foreign to natural law theory. So we're hoping to advance it to help maybe clarify a logical space where compatibility can be discussed. I'm not going to be so bold as to say that my thesis is the correct one, but I'm advancing it as a kind of fourth consideration, say, from the three you've given. And I don't know, Suan, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, so I think it's just worth saying, I think our positions on the issue. So what we aren't going to argue is that the death penalty is intrinsically evil. We're not going to argue that. Rather, I think Daniel and I are advocating a version of the compatibility thesis. That's the main kind of position we're forwarding. Although I think the main difference between me and Daniel is, at least personally, to speak for myself, I'm more open to the idea I'm not saying that I actually endorse or believe this, but I'm more open to the idea that the church could say the death penalty is intrinsically evil. But I'm not saying or advocating that right now. I would say that my current position on the matter is that I hold the death penalty in moral suspicion. I don't particularly, the more that, and this is a kind of a whole story in and of itself of how I got to where I am now, but I hold it in moral suspicion, and that can go in a number of different directions. And Daniel has his particular case for, I think, the compatibility thesis. I have my particular case, but that's just something to put on the table.
Yeah.
And I should also say too that on this podcast, I'm only representing myself. So as you guys probably know, I work for the church, specifically for a bishop. I'm not representing him or any of his thoughts. I'm representing myself only as a private theologian.
Yeah, good. Let me just say two more things I think might be helpful. I want to again emphasize that this is a uniquely Catholic conversation, because some people might just focus on the scriptural data and say, well, look, because obviously part of this debate is, well, it seems like there's lots in scripture that sanctions the death penalty, and people are like, well, we can interpret the scriptural data in this way, and I want to say that's kind of irrelevant, because it's how the church interpreted the scriptural data for so long that really matters, and there I don't think there's any debate, right? So I'm not so interested in, well, you could look at Genesis this way or Romans this way. It's like, it's very clear that for so long the church interpreted it, and it's for Catholics, it's that internal consistency that really matters. I'll be curious to hear what you say about natural law. Obviously, a lot of what was what came out of the church was based in the traditional natural law justification for the death penalty. But it really is trying to find that consistency between what the church taught for so long at a very seemingly high level, and versus what is being said now. The other thing I just want to throw on the table is I'll be curious your guys' thoughts on this, and we can just flag it for now and come back to it later. Is a lot of the conversation, and I find this exceptionally dodgy, that tries to aim for a compatibility thesis is on the idea of development of doctrine, and this idea of the development of doctrine around our understanding of human dignity. And I have to say, I have a huge problem with this, right? Because it would seem like the permissibility of the death penalty hinges on like epistemological considerations, like, oh, well, we came to understand that human dignity better. So now the death penalty is morally illicit. And that seems crazy to me, right? Like either the human dignity was there all along, or it wasn't, right? Like human dignity itself does not change, like ontologically speaking. So whether or not we understood it is entirely irrelevant. If our understanding now is right, then it was always there, and the death penalty was always wrong, full stop. So I've seen that thrown out. So unless somebody has like a very clever way of understanding that I have not been able to wrap my head around, I just find that sort of response is deeply unsatisfying, and in some ways discrediting to a lot of what development of doctrine is supposed to be, right? Which is a further sort of conceptual unfurling or unpacking, right? It's not a reversal, right? Reversal is absolutely what we don't want to say concerning development doctrine. I don't know if you guys want to say anything quick about that. Go for it. Otherwise, we can keep moving along. Yeah,
I do want to say a couple of things. Number one, to some degree, Suan said this might be the difference between Daniel and I, and what I would say is actually no, I don't think that's a difference between us. But I also want to say to Pat, the idea that the capital punishment is morally licit is a position I take, and that so that sounds like a direct contradiction, right? That I'm hedging, and I think if we're really going to defend a robust compatibility thesis, just laying our cards on the table, let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that this is the direction of the papal magisterium, the magisterium of the church is heading towards a declaration of it being intrinsically evil, this death penalty discussion. And so how can I square the circle of saying I accept that, and I also accept that capital punishment's been and remains morally licit? So that's going to be my task. I do think that you're right, Pat, about this ontological dignity, as Pope Francis has called it, that it's just always been true, even if it hasn't always been understood. I think that there's some parts to what Thomas Aquinas says about human dignity that I struggle with. And we've talked about it, this idea that a criminal can become so reduced in their dignity that they become like brutes.
Like a beast, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is contrary to the gospel, or it's a kind of phenomenological observation of one's dignity that they've debased themselves, but that cannot alter their fundamental character as being made in the image of God. And here I'm talking about Thomas's justification of capital punishment.
Punishing. He has a section on punishing sinners specifically.
In general, punishing sinners, that he talks about this reduction in dignity. And I'm not sure that I can accept that or I understand it properly. I'm not sure that it works. But those are just some things to consider. My case, I'm not building entirely around the idea of this growing understanding of dignity, but I think it is an important, what I would say, necessary condition that we kind of put a pin into the idea that there is this ontological dignity that is irrevocable and inalienable. And so as in Suan's discussion with Dr. Fastigi, the church has come to understand that even the criminal doesn't lose their dignity. I thought that was a brilliant point. I loved that it was brought out using Cain as an example in Genesis, preceding the Noahic covenant in Genesis 9:6, where you see that famous phrase about by man shall their blood be shed, and that's actually seemingly justified on the Imago Dei, which I think is what the dignity of the human presents to us is a paradox through the lens of our own fallen nature and lex talionis, that we that when you violate someone's dignity by, say, killing them, that cries out for some sort of response in kind, and yet that response in kind seemingly involves the destruction of another who has the Imago Dei, and how that works out. And I'm going to try to, again, work through that, but I want to turn it maybe to Suan first. Do you want to work through what you have to say? And then I kind of...
Real quick, if you don't mind, Daniel, since you brought up Dr. Fastigi, I do want to give Suan an opportunity to say something there, because you did have a conversation with Dr. Fastigi very recently. Edward Fazer posted a response to that. So I'll link that below so people can both see that conversation and Fazer's response. Is there anything you wanted to say in response to Fazer's response before we start developing your guys' further position? Just wanted to give you the opportunity. You don't have to take it if you don't want, but it's there. Yeah.
Oh, well, let me just first say to Daniel, apologies if I mischaracterized what our difference actually is, because, I think Daniel and I, we've been talking back and forth, and we have a basic fundamental agreement that we're going to go with the compatibility thesis. But I'm just curious to see where we might differ. We might not actually differ at all. We'll see. But it's good to know. And so, all the ins and outs, the contours of this, we're kind of thinking aloud at this point and getting our full thoughts out. So, Daniel, if I mischaracterized anything, my apologies.
No, my aim is to convince both of you. So.
Hey,
Okay.
Look, cards on the table. So even though I lean in a certain direction, which is pretty much where Fazer is, and I remember Fazer had a nice line in his post of saying, like, I'm all ears, and so am I. Like, I don't like these tensions. Why would I? Like, so if somebody can give me a nice account that satisfies my intellect and make it, like, I would love to have it. But at the same time, like, that pesky intellect, man, it sees those tensions and sees those problems, right? So no, I'm very, very open to that idea and look forward to hearing to it. So back to you, Suan. Yeah, about
and let me just say the other point about what Dr. Fastigi says with respect to that pesky intellect. As Catholics who are somewhat public. I'm less public than maybe the two of you, but I'm always conscious about submitting my will and intellect to the magisterium of the church,
For sure.
not causing scandal by taking them in an uncharitable way. And that came across. I had a dialogue with Eric Ibarra, whom I greatly respect, about papal comments around pathways to God and interreligious dialogue. And that was sort of a point in that as well, that I really think it's important in understanding that submission of intellect and will. I don't believe that's the religious assent of faith. I don't think that means I have to actively believe it's part of the deposit of faith. Part of it, I think, is the willingness to say, I don't know, I don't understand it fully. I trust the truth will eventually work itself out, and clarifications that need to be made will be made. And so what I'm offering here is a sort of tenuous attempt to provide, maybe if someone thinks it's meritorious to consider this path, as a way to understand the magisterium. I also understand some might say, oh, yours is even more strained than the other compatibility thesis that you were mentioning, that it's just a prudential judgment. But we'll see. We'll see.
Okay. Yeah, good. All right, Suan, with respect to Dr. Fazer's response to you, anything you want to put on the table there before we...
Yeah, so just a few comments. I think one is, I appreciate that Dr. Fazer took the time to write such a post. And as always, he's very lucid, very clear. And I enjoy reading everything that he writes. In fact, right behind me is his book on immortal souls. So, I have nothing but respect for Dr. Fazer. And also, it's kind of funny that, we're having this conversation, and he's kind of the guy who taught me natural law theory. I read John Finnis first, Natural Law, Natural Rights. And then eventually, I thought, okay, well, that's what natural law theory is. And then I found Fazer's work on natural law theory, the perverted faculty argument. So it's kind of like weird debating one of your own heroes. But, I just have nothing but respect for Fazer.
Me too.
Regarding the post itself, so there's a lot that I thought was actually just like fine and I agreed with. And I thought, yeah, that's good. That's fair. So when he, says that we need to be careful to distinguish between whether or not, we're saying the death penalty is intrinsically evil, or we're arguing that it's not intrinsically evil, but the church shouldn't do it, right? When he was going through being specific about what you're targeting. Yeah, I appreciate his precision there. And at the same time, though, I will say that, I think he's kind of fair, because there were some, and I respect Professor Fastigi immensely, but there were some parts in the interview where I was kind of like, oh, I feel like we're kind of getting a little bit muddy on that distinction. And that's why I asked that right at the start. What is the church teaching? What are we claiming? What are you defending? But then eventually, because Fastigi is explicitly, very open to the idea of the death penalty being declared intrinsically evil, I think at some point there was some blurriness. But leaving that aside, I only have one critical comment about Fazer's post, which was just, so he says, and Sonna admits that, quote, maybe we can't dispute that the state has the right technically to do it, end quote. So I think in that part of the conversation, and this is not a fault on him, it's just a clarification, I was parroting or summarizing what I thought was like the common position among some of the sources, right? Some of the sources seem to say that, okay, the state maybe has the right to do it, but we shouldn't witness it. We shouldn't take part in it. We should try to distance ourselves from the act of capital punishment when it's administered. So, because I'm, like I said, and I'll say it here, like I'm open to that possibility of the death penalty being declared intrinsically evil, but that wasn't representative of my position. It was my summary of what I thought the sources were saying.
Right. So let me ask you there, Suan. You say you're open to that position, so I'd want to hear you respond to two things. One are essentially the claims that Fazer makes with the receipts that, no, this is an irreformable teaching. So you must think that he's wrong there. If you're open to it being taught as intrinsically evil. And two, the point I made about it being, even if it's not irreformable, it does seem it would be uniquely scandalous, right? That something that was intrinsically evil was taught repeatedly at a very high level and actively carried out by the church. So that's where I'm I'm not as, I don't have that sort of wiggle room that you do. Like for me, like,
yeah.
I mean, like if last option, maybe, right? But like that is the one I'm most resistant to for those
yeah.
particular reasons. So I just, if you have some counter thoughts, that I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, in this conversation, there's like kind of two different levels to it, right? There's there's first just the rationality of what the magisterium is saying right now and how we square it with natural law theory and trying to provide an apologetic for it. And then there's the question of the receipts and continuity and just how the magisterium works. And those are interrelated, obviously, but there are different ways that you can emphasize that.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, Pat, I would have to go into my position on the issue, because once you see my position and at least why I would defend something at least like a compatibility thesis, I think you can see then how I would be more okay with wiggle room,
Okay.
and then how I would account for the question of development. So, I mean, I could do that now and get into my position, or Daniel can get into his position.
Yeah, why don't we get to it? I think we've done enough kind of stage setting here. And one more point about the natural law thing. I think it's sort of like the scripture thing. Like it's interesting if you could make the natural law case, show like, okay, these people using natural law before, good principles, not always the right conclusion on a death penalty. That's an interesting development in natural law. But again, the biggest issue for Catholics is that internal consistency between what the church did clearly teach before versus now. So, but whatever. It's all rock and roll, I guess. So yeah. All right. Which one wants to go first here? Because I know you both had different thoughts on the matter.
I'll give way to Swan since he was on a roll there.
Sure. Yeah. And like, Daniel and we have, I think, different ways of basically getting to the same conclusion. So I have my preferred route. He has his preferred route, but I don't think we're saying that either is like the only way, right? I don't think he's saying that I'm wrong or, at least, well, let me first say my position, and then Daniel can tell me, what's wrong with it or if he agrees with it.
Well, what you're both offering are possibilities here, right? For a compatibility thesis that people might not have considered before, and just having that conceptual space open can be helpful for people who just see certain tensions here that they would not like to live with. So yeah, again, emphasizing none of you are necessarily going to the mat like this is absolutely correct. You have to read this, but you're offering possibilities, models, stuff like that. So yeah, good. Yep.
Okay, so I'll just go with my position then. So I think the way that I arrived at my position is I kind of meditated on this particular question. So God was technically within his rights not to save us. He has no obligations to us. We don't generate obligations in him. He technically is within his divine, if you will, natural rights to not save us. He didn't have to become incarnate. He didn't have to atone. He didn't have to do any of that. But God freely chose, out of his love, out of his goodness, to do that particular act, even though he was in his rights not to do it. And so when we think about the divine nature applied to that particular situation, we would say it's unthinkable or unimaginable, though, based on the goodness of God, based on his love for humanity and the act of investing in giving us being and life and creating us in his image, that he wouldn't try to save us, that he wouldn't reach out, even though he technically had the right to not do it, right? And so when it comes to the death penalty, my position, at least with this compatibility approach, is this. Look, you technically have the right to administer the death penalty, based on, let's say, the fact that the person has committed some horrendous, heinous act. Usually the condition is life for life, right? You take a life, you can lose your life. Just something severe of that sort where there has to be a proportionality. What I'm saying is that it seems as if, though, let's say even if we did or do have the right to administer the death penalty, there's something that should be unthinkable about a Christian doing that or agreeing with that. I'm drawing that analogy there. And the argument would be basically this. I think that the revolution that Christ brought in terms of ethics and our moral vision is that under the natural law, right, we are natural subjects. We're viewed as human beings, as rational social animals. And it seems perfectly rational, right, under that system to have lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, a foot for a foot. It seems totally rational to seek punishment of your enemies ruthlessly, right? Because if they offend you, that honor has been taken from you, you get that honor back. But it's interesting that Jesus, says that this is not how his moral vision is. You've been taught an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a foot for a foot. But I say, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And so there's this interesting question then on what did Jesus do to justify this transition. Excuse me, a motorcycle is going by. What did Jesus do to justify this transition in our moral thinking? And I think the answer is that we view man obviously as a rational social animal, but now he's elevated to be viewed in light of his supernatural end, right? As somebody who is created to be in relationship with God. And so the question becomes like, look, I could have the right to punish someone and get my justice back, right? Give to each what he is due. So I get what's due back to me. In some way, the punishment of the other, the pain inflicted upon them, the deprivation of goods somehow compensates for the loss of whatever I've suffered. That seems to be like standard theories of punishment and retribution. But it's unthinkable to do that if it is the case, right, that by not inflicting that punishment, I actually am able to get that person to experience mercy, experience themselves as God's child, as something higher and directed towards a higher end. And so when, just to get a few more thoughts out before, I turn into a rambling mess, I'm reminded of when I was at Harvard, I took a class on forgiveness, and we had to actually sit and really think about what is the rational basis for Christian teaching on forgiveness, because some people in the class and throughout the world, in fact, just think that the Christian view on forgiveness is incompatible with justice, right? Because justice demands punishment and equal for equal compensation for whatever faults are done. But forgiveness in the Christian view seems to cancel out, the seeking of a punishment or debts or that sort of thing. And so I was thinking to myself, okay, there has to be a way to square what seems to be really intuitive, because we don't think it's wrong for the state to punish people, even though we would want them to operate with Christian morality. So it wouldn't be the case, for example, that if we had a Christian society, that there would be no more prisons or some type of punishment, right? But how do we then also live out Christ's ethic of forgiveness? And the solution that I came up with, right, is that even in the act of punishing, we think about that person as not being totally reducible down to their evil action, that they are still more than that, and that there's the possibility of their redemption and praying for their conversion. What is forgiveness? Forgiveness isn't pretending that nothing happened. Forgiveness is saying, look, I know that you did this horrible thing, but I'm going to change my attitude towards you and see you as God sees you, as someone precious and beautiful and valuable. And so whatever punishment I do actually inflict, or whatever course of justice I do pursue, it takes due consideration of that aspect of who you are. And so just to go into some other cases, I mean, it's interesting. I think, Daniel, we're going to talk about this in the case of the government and the argument that actually the threat of the death penalty or the person on death row, it gives them an opportunity to convert on the way, right? Because we're going to talk about that particular argument for the death penalty. But one thing that I've thought about is, I remember, I watched this video of, the serial killer who was finally caught, and the conviction came down that he would be sentenced to life, if not death. I forget which sentence he received. And there's a part where the witnesses are coming up and they're saying their impact statements. And there's one man who stood up and he said, look, I'm a Christian, and sir, you've made me question everything that I believe. I think the serial killer had killed his daughter, if I'm not mistaken, or his granddaughter. And he said, but look, I'm a Christian and I forgive you for what you did. And it was interesting because throughout this whole trial, when the witnesses were giving their impact statements, or the victim impact statement, all of them said, I hope you burn in hell. I hope you die. And the serial killer was stoic. But when that man came up and said, I forgive you, the serial killer finally broke and he cried. And it was because he was just used to this idea that he was irredeemable, the world hated him and wanted him dead and gone. And when he was actually shown love and forgiveness, you know, he was still going to receive his punishment of, I think it was a life sentence. He's still going to live with the guilt of what he did. But that idea that I no longer just view him as this natural subject, this rational animal with whom my honor has been lost, so he has to pay for it with his suffering. But you still are called to that relationship with God. And so I'm going to treat you, even as you're being punished, in a way that that magnifies that aspect of who you are. There, you know, there's a scene in a movie that I watched where, you know, there's a mother who's talking to a pastor or minister about, you know, the fact that her son had done a horrible crime. And she says to the pastor, yes, my son did that, but that's not all he did. There's still humanity there. There's still a little, even in what that, you know, the man did and what other criminals have done, there's still a mother's love. There's still a little boy. There's still a child. There's still something broken that needs to be fixed by Christ's blood.
Yeah. Good. So let me just do a few quick thoughts there. And I'll start with the things I agree with is yeah, absolutely, for the individual, that is the Christian attitude we're all called to. That is what we should all do, you know, when giving it, you know, what was it called, an impact report? I haven't heard that thing before, right? Will we all do what we should do? That's a whole different question, right? If some serial killer murdered all of my children, like, would I be able to, like, by God's grace, I hope I could do that, right? And I also pray I'm never in that particular position. But you're absolutely right. That is the Christian attitude of every individual to anybody who has wronged them or done any evil, is to that sort of that radical forgiveness, right? That's right. But is that incompatible with punishment, including punishment of capital punishment? And my initial response is, if so, I don't particularly initially see that, right? One could see that individual giving that mercy of forgiveness could, you know, stir that killer to repentance before the state. And let's be clear, like, it's not the individual that, you know, gives a death penalty to somebody else, right? It's always been very clear in natural law that it is, the individual has no authority for that whatsoever, right? This is the state, right, and right, that has the authority for that. Then enacts that punishment, and also just as and this is somewhat related to your point, Suan, but also just more background in traditional natural law, and this goes back to themes you find in Plato, but also in Boethius, is that punishment itself is a good for the individual. Right. So it's just important that capital punishment, traditionally understood, had nothing to do with utility, including the possible utility of either facilitating conversion. That's an interesting thing, right? Because I've heard people say, well, capital punishment, like, man, there's nothing more pressing than that. If anything's going to get somebody to turn towards God, it's knowing that they're walking towards the hangman. Other people push back and say you need more time, right? Just to give them more time. And everyone has their counterexamples. Well, people just harden with time or whatever. I don't have a whole lot to say about that, honestly. I think that's, and I certainly don't have any survey data on something like that, right? But it was rather not concerns about utility at all. It was a matter of whether something was due, or even if it wasn't exactly proportionate, at least not wholly out of proportion, right? And you find this in Boethius, that a punishment is good for the unrepentant person, even if they don't want it. Like, that is an ontological good. It is better for them to be punished than not for what they have. And I think, especially for Catholics, we definitely can't think that forgiveness and punishment are incompatible if we're going to hold to any doctrine of purgatory or anything like that. So those would be some initial concerns I have with I like a lot of what you said, Suan, but to me, it doesn't necessarily seem to, like, either put capital punishment off the table, not only prudentially, but certainly not as an intrinsic evil. You see what I'm saying? Does that sound fair to you?
Yeah. So yeah, and there are two things there. So I think you pointed out, okay, I needed to tie the thread and put the bow together, right? So I think that's a fair point. So, you know, how would I argue from my position to the fact that we should not and cannot administer the death penalty, right? So, you know, I actually agree with your premise, and I think this is what I was trying to get across, that it's not incompatible with forgiveness to administer punishment, right? That was what I was saying. Yeah. I think the turn in the moral vision of Christ is that you don't just view someone as this natural subject, right? This rational social animal, but also as a child of God, as someone beloved by God, right? And towards that supernatural end of what will move this person to convert and see God's love and that they are wanted, and open the door for repentance. And so in the case of the death penalty, I think that um, the way that I would just make the case from what I said to the conclusion is that, the death penalty by its very nature, right, is a cruel act. It's a brutal act because you have to somehow force, right, the life out of somebody. It takes some degree of effort to kill somebody. And whenever, and my point is that when you look upon someone, as wanted by God, as loved by God, as all those things that I said before, in the fullness of their humanity, like Christ before the Father, giving every single defense that he can of us, right, interceding before the Father. I don't know, every time I think about even a criminal who's done something horrible, and I look at them in that light, trying to do whatever I can to say something about their humanity, it's unimaginable to then administer something that would be brutal and cruel, that is to take their life and to remove them from this world. So I would say that, like, the way that I draw the thread is that there's something characteristically brutal and violent about the death penalty, such that this really isn't necessarily an argument from strict principle, right, or duty. Like I said before, going back to the analogy that I gave of even though God was technically in his rights not to save us, it would be unthinkable for him not to do that based on the virtue of his love and his goodness. And so I'm saying that based on at least the death penalty here, and the fact that it is by nature a pretty cruel and brutal act, I think that gives us reasons for extreme pause to not administer it based on what we believe about the sacredness of the human person.
Okay. Two more, one or two more points, and I'll let you have the last word on this. And I guess I'm sort of here to pressure test your guys' theories, right?
Yeah.
That's fair. Right. So I guess there's lots of forms of punishment, including just basic corporal punishment and life imprisonment and stuff like that could be characterized as brutal to various extents. I don't know if I want to say cruel, because I think that sort of skews toward question begging, right? It's is it deserved or is it not, right? Even if it involves some act of not just coercion but violence and stuff like that. Certainly, some methods of execution are, I guess, particularly. I mean, I certainly don't think I would be advocating for whatever went on in that Braveheart movie, right? But I guess my concern here would be, would this line of argument essentially undermine any or other forms of punishment, including especially particularly a doctrine of hell? And maybe one wants to take a softer doctrine of hell or something like that, or punishment in purgatory or something like that. But it seems like the church, again, and we're focusing on internal consistency within Catholic teaching, has always seen as just various degrees of physical pain, right? As appropriate administrations of justice, as things that are deserved, as due. So I'd want to hear more than just assertions against that, right? Because that's sort of what's on up for debate right now. And I think there are certainly more cruel things that you can do, like genuinely cruel things that you could do to people that aren't just killing them, that I think are off the table. Like, I do think torture, obviously, is off the table morally. I don't think that you can torture somebody to get some information out of them or something like that. I don't think that that's morally illicit. And I think we lost Dano there for a minute. And this and this is not incompatible, I think, with the genuine love and care for any individual. And again, I guess it comes back to one's prior understanding of justice, of I mean, again, whether you even think the notion of punishment itself is a good, and what you can kind of neatly fit under that. I think Catholics just have less wiggle room here from what they're currently committed to in terms of orthodoxy with respect to purgatory and at least even the possibility of hell. Like, even if you don't think that, even if you're like a hopeful universalist, I mean, it does seem like you're at least committed to the possibility that people could have been in hell, right? The various torments and stuff like that, right? So it's not, again, there's a sort of wider system at play here where if you go down a certain direction, even if it alleviates tensions in one area, is it going to create worse tensions in other areas? I said that'd be my last word, so I won't push it further here. But for future considerations and research, Swan, you can have the final last word on that if there's any other points of defense you wanna
and Pat, this is very helpful because, like, on the one hand, like, all this has been in my head and quietly in my armchair as I'm thinking, and praying and meditating upon this issue. So what you're doing is you're helping me get more precise. And I think, this is the whole point why we had this show, so that we can get our thoughts out and kind of give a first jab at our thoughts on this issue. So, I mean, you mentioned, regarding like the doctrine of hell, right? And just the potential for this to be like a slippery slope. And I'm not unsympathetic to that concern. And also I do affirm that the two senses of pain in hell, the pain of loss and the pain of sense, right? Those two things I do affirm. I think already, though, even let's say in somebody like Father James Dominic Rooney and his defense of hell, he, in my opinion at least, he recasts the idea of hell not so much as being torture, which was kind of an old and popular view, with pitchforks and demons poking at you, Apocalypse of Peter, 2nd century men being hung from their genitals. I mean, that was a very old idea of hell. It's just kind of like a big, massive torture chamber that most theologians at this point don't advocate for anymore, without giving up on the idea of eternal conscious torment involving the two senses of pain that I just articulated.
Right.
So, so it is true that even how we articulate now the doctrine of hell has shifted in light of the fact of our positions on torture. And oftentimes, hell is more portrayed as a tragedy than this like great, torture fest. So that's one thing to say just there. Moving on then, I mean, I would also say too that with kind of maybe not being so just asserting the point, right, or being question begging, but really getting at the heart of what's going on here. I mean, the position as I take it is that, like, a lot of people have this idea that, okay, take, for example, Erica Kirk and how she responded to the death of her husband, and the reason why she didn't advocate for the death of her husband's killer. She said, basically, if I was to go to heaven and see Christ face to face, and he would look at me and he would say, what, we're now doing an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth? Is that what we're doing? So, and a lot of people praised her, even pro-death penalty people praised her, right? Because they said, wow, this is so great that Erica, is doing this great act of charity. But if you listen to what Erica was saying, and if you listen to the logic of what she's saying, she's not treating that as if it was an option on the table, that she could have advocated for her husband's killer, to be executed. She was saying something more substantial deep down, and she was attributing that to the authority of Christ and actual words that he said in the New Testament, right? That we won't be doing an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, or a foot for a foot. And the point I'm trying to make is that even today, then, what Erica Kirk did was not the supererogatory act. It wasn't going above and beyond. And Phaser talks about, the death penalty being contrary to the higher demands of Christian morality. I'm just saying that's just morality in light of Christ. That is the natural law. That is Christ's law, right? That we are all under the authority of now.
Right. Suan, we talked about that. We don't have it's not above and beyond the call of duty to become a saint.
Yeah. So let me just, I know I said his last word, but one thing to think about further again here is maybe that's right. Like maybe that is what we are given to in scripture, this or that. And maybe that's the position any Christian should hold on capital punishment. But what that doesn't do yet is alleviates the issues of how the church essentially taught the opposite for so long.
Well, okay, so Pat,
Yeah.
so
Maybe-
oh, sorry, go ahead, Daniel.
Well, maybe this would be. Should I start to make the case for how that we can bridge that? I don't know. Did you want? Or
Well,
go
so
ahead.
I do have some thoughts on like how you bridge that teaching in the magisterium. Although obviously, like, and that's a whole nother topic, right? So what I took this long just to get through.
Yeah. But I want to be clear
Yeah.
that is the topic for Catholics, though, right?
Sure,
And that's
right.
what I was trying to focus on at the beginning. So, like, one could, as a non-Catholic, right, and even as maybe as a non-Catholic natural law theorist, make your case.
Right.
I'll say I'm still a bit skeptical for some of the
Oh,
reasons I exist, but as a Catholic, you have to deal with the data internal to the church, right? That's the biggest the biggest thing, right? So yeah, I don't. Maybe you have something to say on it now, or go to Daniel or whatever, because it is as an internal problem for Catholics. That's the major issue right now. Yeah,
I'll make 2 quick points. Okay. So I mean, I think it's still possible, right, to reconcile all of this even with past magisterial teachings, and there are 2 ways to basically do that. So the first is, if you're only looking at magisterial statements on the death penalty and capital punishment, I understand why that's relevant to the conversation, but I think it's far too narrow. And here's why. So, for example, let's take another issue like, could the church ever redefine our teaching on marriage, right? That it's a union of one man and one woman. Well, obviously not, right? But on top of that, if you take, for example, what Pope St. Paul VI wrote in Humane Vitae, and how the lovemaking act is supposed to be directed or at least open towards life, right? That was on the issue of contraception. But that principle from Humane Vitae could be applied into the question of the redefinition of marriage. And so when you start looking at also other cases, like how, for example, even, well, we're against torture, but even among the popes who said torture is fine, they said, but you can't do permanent damage. Right. Now, of course, like, no damage is technically permanent because in the resurrection, our bodies are restored. But I mean, what could be more permanent, right, than taking someone's life in a certain respect, right? If you're against torture or torture that inflicts a permanent damage upon somebody, well, the damage of killing someone is also, in a sense, permanent in an analogous way, right? And so I would just say there that you could start taking other magisterial teachings and piling them on into this particular question.
So
And
here's just a quick question. I mean, part of this is obviously going to come down around what the definition of torture is, which is a pretty tricky subject, right?
Yeah.
Because obviously I don't think anyone wants to say that torture is just inflicting pain on somebody, right? Because we think that there's at least certain instances where that's definitely justifiable, right? So it has to be something a little bit more circumscribed on that. I don't know if we want to. I don't know. I might have just opened up a whole can we don't want to.
Well, let me say this. Say this. And like, I think, it's fair to have this pushback. But I'm just let me just lay out the foundation of how I would begin to give a response, right? And then obviously, like, all the implications and questions, we have to face that down the line, right? So I'm not saying that this is the end of the conversation. So I don't want you to think I'm cutting you off or saying I'm closed off to what you're saying. So I just want to be fair to you, Pat. So that's one thing. I mean, you could start taking a cumulative approach with magisterial teachings to soften what seems to be such a radical rupture. I mean, not to open a can of worms, but even with my work on Nicaea 2 and icons, and how I handled Gavin Ortland's claim that the church did a 180 on icons and images and veneration, right? The church, to get to that conclusion on images, used theology related to the incarnation and the Trinity to get to a doctrine on images. And so the church has historically used things that were, and Ortland complains that this is kind of off topic or that's irrelevant. No, it's not, right? These things are connected. And so I think you can start more easily making that magisterial case if you start considering other principles that shape our conception of human dignity, like you can't inflict permanent effects from torture upon an individual. And then you can make an analogy with death. But then the second thing I want to say, and this is literally it for me, Pat, okay? The second thing is I really liked the fact that Fazer said, look, with respect to the claim that, quote, the church always taught for 2,000 years that the death penalty is not only not intrinsically wrong, but that it is generally a good idea and should be used, right? With respect to that position, Phaser said, by contrast, claim 2, the claim I just read, is indeed false. So the claim that's indeed false, at least on Phaser's view, is not that the church, taught that the death penalty is not intrinsically wrong. What's false is that it is a generally good idea and should be used. He agreed that that is indeed false for the reasons that Fastigi gives. So,
right, yeah,
it seems as if there's a way in which you could see that even if the church said, okay, the state can administer the punishment, it's not intrinsically evil, we still have different kinds of reservations on when it should be used and applied. And it seems to me that when you take all of this cumulatively, I think the church is totally right to say, yes, it's inadmissible, and we have actual moral concerns from the logic of the gospel.
So yeah, I agree with a good amount of that. Again, if it's a prudential decision, I'm totally open to all of that, right? The one thing, just because it's still in the back of my mind, is this torture thing, right? So torture typically relates to like breaking somebody's will, right? And it involves obviously pain that isn't necessarily deserved by that person for the breaking of their will. So I just don't think there's a path from that, because capital punishment isn't, or at least it shouldn't be used to break somebody's will, right? If it's used, it's because it's deserved. And the same thing, like the church has taught, and I think it is a good natural case that pain can be deserved. But yeah, if you're just putting pain into somebody to break their will to convert, for example, or to give you information, that's not licit, right? For sure.
Pat, but then you just undid one of the arguments for the death penalty, which is that the threat of the death penalty causes potentially a conversion of the person.
No, but I said that shouldn't be. I remember I said it's not for utility. I said, so I disagree with that, right? If you're using the death penalty just as a way to get somebody to convert, that's not legitimate, right? Yeah, it's either deserved from what they did or it's not. All I said is that sometimes people will counter a death penalty by saying, if you give them more time, they'll convert. And then obviously people who are pro-death penalty will say, well, there's no guarantee people can harden with time, and maybe just seeing the hangman will do more work there. That's a secondary consideration, but not itself that could just to be clear what my position is. Yeah.
Right. Because Pat, it sounded like to me you were saying that what makes torture problematic is that, one, you're trying to break the will of the person. And what would make torture problematic is, one, you're breaking the will of the person through a permanent effect or a permanent harm, right?
I don't know about the permanent thing. I would have to look into that. My understanding is the delineation around torture is that there's a certain pain or violence, and it can be mental, right? It doesn't have to be physical, for the purposes of breaking someone's will. But there's not necessarily some prior evil that they did that merits the punishment or the evil. I'm sure there probably are statements in the history about permanence or something. I'm just not clear on that. But my current understanding of, because I don't think we as Catholics, but I don't think anybody should want to say that inflicting of pain is always bad on somebody, right? So there has to be some difference maker here. And I think that difference maker relates to particularly the infliction of pain or violence or something to break somebody's will for some future purpose, right? Not as whereas putting pain or violence into somebody as a form of punishment for what is owed. That's that's where the proponent of the death penalty would be like, yeah, this is why it's not torture, right? The line of torture isn't gonna go through here or something like that. Sorry, that is my absolute last point. Final words go to you for sure.
And that's just to be fair, that's a fine symmetry breaker there. I think I would still try to argue for an analogy, but obviously all analogies have elements of discontinuity in them. But that's something that's to be figured out down the line. So I'll let Daniel now talk.
Well, I've been.
Thank you for your holy patience, sir.
And there's so much that could be said, so I'll try to keep my comments kind of organized as best I can. And of course, maybe both of you will want to interject, but I thought I would start. Can you share the screen that I had pulled up? Is it still possible?
It's all orange, but I think I pulled it up.
All right, let me see.
It is Halloween, so it's very. There we go.
Is it visible now?
Yes.
So, I wanted to start with, because I see Suan's position as developed out of the dignity point, right? And I think that's beautiful. I was thinking, I love, my favorite epistle is Galatians. And there's this line where Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. And I started thinking about this in terms of my conversation with Suan. And I sort of reconceptualizing what Christianity is, and maybe this is what it always has been. It is a sacramental religion in which we're transformed. So we become like a symbol of the Eucharist, right? With transubstantiation, where the bread and wine, those elements literally become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. And in a sense, Paul's saying the same thing of us, that we become Christ in our baptism. And this calls to mind, I was looking at a sermon by Augustine, who's reflecting on the Eucharist. He says, the bread is one, and we, though many, are one body. Understand and rejoice. Unity, truth, faithfulness, love. One bread, he says. What is this one bread? It is not the one body formed from many. Remember, bread doesn't come from a single grain, but from many. When you receive exorcism, you were ground. When you were baptized, you were leavened. And when you received the fire of the Holy Spirit, you were baked. Be what you see, receive what you are. And this really, I think, is the revelation that Christ gives us of what it means to be in the image of God through the incarnation, through entering into his humanity. Jesus elevates our humanity so that we can become Christ. We can become one with him, united in him, sanctified, become saints. That's why I said it's not going above and beyond the duty to become what Christ calls us to be. And that kind of means that the material of our humanity is like an element of a sacrament. And that's how I understand the ontological dignity that Francis is talking about, or talked about, and that the recent popes, I would say the last 4 popes, have really been drilling down on human dignity. So that's just to sort of set up for what I'm going to talk about, and trying to bridge between Suan and my own position. I am going to take the position that from the CDF, which is that it, let me see if I can bring it up. It's here that they say, that it's an authentic development of doctrine and not a contradiction with the prior teachings of the magisterium. These teachings, in fact, can be explained in light of the primary responsibility of the public authority to protect the common good in social contexts, in which the penal sanctions were understood differently and had developed in an environment in which it was more difficult to guarantee that the criminal could not repeat his crime. The new revisions affirm the understanding of the inadmissibility of the death penalty grew in light of the gospel. The gospel, in fact, helps us understand better the order of creation that the Son of God assumed, purified, and brought to fulfillment. It also invites us to the mercy and patience of the Lord that gives us, to each person, the time to convert oneself. And so that ties into what you both were talking about with torture. I wanted to go back to some of the comments of Thomas Aquinas. This is when he's talking about, I'm going to go down first because I think this is interesting. Whether it's lawful for clerics, but listen to what he says because it is illuminating here. He says, it is unlawful for clerics to kill for 2 reasons. First, because they're chosen for the ministry of the altar, whereupon they represent the passion of Christ slain, who when he was struck did not strike. Therefore, it becomes not clerics to strike or kill, for ministers should imitate their master, according to Sirach 2:10. As the judge of the people is himself, so also are his ministers. The other reason is because clerics are entrusted with the ministry of the new law, wherein no punishment of death or of bodily maiming is appointed. Wherefore they should abstain from such things in order that they may be fitting ministers of the New Testament. So that does suggest something has happened with the new law, which is why Thomas Aquinas didn't think clerics should be the ones that put people to death. I just want to highlight that. I'm not arguing that then extends to the state, but it is very telling. What I did want to go with to sort of set the stage here, of course, is whether it's lawful to kill sinners. And Aquinas clearly citing Exodus and Psalm 100, that I put to death all the wicked of the land, that it is permissible. And that is what I'm going to say is true. What he says specifically is, if a man be dangerous or infectious to the community on account of some sin, it is praiseworthy and advantageous that he be killed in order to safeguard the common good, since a little leaven corrupteth the whole lump. So there are some qualifications here that I think we need to pay attention to. One is that it is to safeguard the common good. That is an end. That's the in order to phrase there. That's an end of this. It might not be the primary end, but it's at least a secondary end of the death penalty or capital punishment. There is also one other thing I want to highlight before I build my case, which is that he takes up this question from Ezekiel 33:11 in the second objection. Further, human justice is conformed to divine justice. Now, according to divine justice, sinners are kept back for repentance, according to Ezekiel 33:11. I desire not the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Therefore, it seems altogether unjust to kill sinners. Wow. Okay, how does he respond to this? He says, according to the order of his wisdom, God sometimes slays sinners forthwith in order to deliver the good, whereas sometimes he allows them time to repent, according as he knows what is expedient for his elect. This also does human justice imitate according to its power, for it puts to death those who are dangerous to others, while it allows time for repentance to those who sin without grievously harming others. So again, this emphasis, something that Suan was trying to bring out, which is that we, and something that the church itself brings out, is this call to repentance in light of the gospel, and that's in light of our human dignity. That's why I think that's relevant and why it's always been operative. But it's clear for Aquinas that the public safety is a concern that sort of trumps this idea that we should keep the wicked sinner around if they're dangerous, right? So you see where I'm going with that, maybe. Is there any question thus far in what I'm talking about?
No, all good so far, Daniel. Yep.
Yeah, Daniel, I'll just say one thing. You know, when you brought up Augustine, when I was entering religious life, they asked me if I'd ever killed anyone. And it wasn't like a question related to like abortion or taking human life, because that was a separate question. But they wanted to know if I had ever taken a life. So just to say that there seems to have always been, even in the tradition, even in the Bible, a squeamishness towards bloodshed, even if in some way it could be fine or defensible.
Okay. Now, in order to address this, the way I've been thinking about it, Pat, because if we're really going to just go, as I said, whole hog and say it is not just inadmissible, whatever that means, but let's just grant that the language around Pope Francis is hedging towards the full claim that it's intrinsically evil. That is, in all circumstances, a violation of the gospel and a violation of human dignity. Let's just grant that as for the sake of argument. I'm not saying it is. I'm not precluding the other.
Right, but it would be a sinful act. Yeah.
Okay, let's just grant that for the sake of argument. How can I reconcile that with the tradition? And I think it's really the first thing we have to ask is, can the natural law be changed? So how does Aquinas answer that? And the answer to that, let me see if I can find where I have it, is in Article 5. This is, I think this is in the first part of the second part, question 94, Article 5, just for reference. And the answer is no, it can't change, at least with the primary precepts, right? What are the primary precepts of the natural law? Those are akin to or analogous to the first principles of a science. In demonstration, you'd use those. It's like the principle of non-contradiction. So what's the greatest precept of the natural law? Do good and avoid evil. That doesn't change. It cannot change. It's immutable. And there are other diverse primary precepts of the natural law. There are also secondary precepts. They are derivative, that in the same way you might derive one proposition from some other premises. So you might have a first precept along with the circumstances that humanity finds itself in light of its sinful nature, say. And those might be generative of secondary precepts. So if there's a primary precept, say for the common good, for its propagation and security, then a secondary precept that follows from promoting the common good or the public good might be various precepts of lex talionis, such as punishment of the sinner. Right? Is that clear? I want to pause when I'm like,
yeah, no, so far so good. Yep.
Okay, so those are changeable, and they are changeable in various ways, and often owing to the circumstances we find ourselves in. And those circumstances are not always accidental. I think we have the sense that something is accidental, right? And therefore, the act we're talking about, an action can be good some way and then bad in other ways. And therefore, it is not intrinsically wrong because the circumstances are always external to the act. But that's not actually what Aquinas says. He does talk about specifying circumstances. And you see this is in Article 18, where he talks about whether circumstances place a moral action in the species of good or evil. He also talks about this in De Malo. I think it's question 4, deals with circumstances as specifying. That is, it's kind of like makes its own species. Just to give an example of this, right? We might have a generic action like having intercourse, which under some circumstances, if it's with one's wife, it can be licit. If it's with another's wife, it becomes illicit. And those aren't just to say the accidental features of having intercourse, but it specifies an action so that one is within the context of marriage and the other is a specific act of fornication or adultery. Likewise, you can have a specifying act. I was sort of thinking of this situation where we have a primary precept towards our own life that leads to certain goods like consuming light meat on occasion. Like on a Wednesday night, you might have a chicken breast with dinner, and that's perfectly morally permissible and licit under natural law. It's good for our nutrition, which is its primary end. However, there could be specifying circumstances where I am a Catholic adult and it is now a religious day of obligation of some sort of fast, say, like on a Friday during Lent. And so I now, in full knowledge of the day, consume meat. And now the specific act in question really is one of religious disobedience,
right,
and not of taking in a nutrient. So we can see that circumstance can alter or change an action, the material of the action, so that it has a different form. And that form can be good or bad. So in the case of what I'm arguing here is that what we call maybe state killing is a generic thing.
Mhm.
And what I would say is morally licit and even praiseworthy is that when state killing is authorized, or it is, say, it has its divine and stately authorization,
Mhm.
right? So that's in place for the safety of the public, then in that case, it is descriptive of a morally licit and even praiseworthy act. And maybe this would be a point of disagreement between me and Swan,
Mhm.
but then what I'm going to argue is that in the act of state killing today, that the circumstances are such that the act now is different. And insofar as it is different, we might even argue that it's possible for it to be intrinsically evil.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good. All right. So Daniel, that's very helpful, especially just getting into some of the nuances of natural law. I think you're making use of some good resources, especially that there are just certain generic actions that need to be specified in order to pick up their moral character. That's definitely right. Right. So let me, just to kind of get right to it. I think that there's three things I would want you to discuss in relation to and it seems like the circumstances here are for you primarily related to deterrence. Is that correct?
Well, so there are we have to figure out what the primary and secondary ends of death penalty or capital punishment are, and we have to figure out. So what I'm saying is it's kind of a secondary what are the primary and secondary ends of this secondary precept, say, that we have to put people to death?
Yeah.
And would you say it's punishment is the primary end?
So this is where I was going to go. Would say that in, the traditional position is that guilt calls for punishment, and the
Right.
graver the offense, the more severe punishment. And even though you have texts from Aquinas which are accurate about protection of the common good, he definitely held generally that sin calls for deprivations of goods, right? And in more serious cases, more serious goods, right? So it's a matter of retribution first and foremost, and then come considerations. This is what we're talking about with Suan, secondary considerations, but defense against the criminal himself or herself. And then there's, other considerations too, maybe just wider deterrence or stuff like that. But I certainly don't think you could make a case for capital punishment again, just on considerations of deterrence. So yeah, the first thing two points to think about, right? One is for yours to support a compatibility thesis. I would be curious how that relates to the matter of capital punishment being something justly deserved for past serious sins, right?
Because it is.
Yeah, that would be.
I grant that 100%.
Yeah,
I'm going to grant all of the evidence that Dr. Feser brings forth.
Great.
All of the previous magisteriums correct. All of the natural law arguments are correct.
Okay, all right. And then the second one for the compatibility thesis is then if you're focusing on specifications that will determine something's moral character, you do still have those statements from Pope Francis saying that it is always a violation of human dignity.
Correct.
And I forget the exact phrase, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just there's no circumstances, right, under which it could be used. So like it's gonna sound hard to square anything with that, right? Yeah.
It's interesting because in Infinitas Dignitas, I think that's how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
He actually can bring that up. There's this point where
I want to make sure I'm not stating it poorly or wrongly. So go ahead and get the actual passage up. If we
I think. Yeah.
I have Feser's. Sure. I have Feser's clip. Okay, so here's what Feser says of the document. For it asserts that, quote, the death penalty violates the inalienable dignity of every person, regardless of the circumstances, end quote. Feser continues, and that this dignity is grounded in, quote, human nature apart from all cultural change, end quote.
Right. And I just wanted to parallel that claim because that's, I think, and this speaks to both compatibility theses. This is Francis, right? Pope Francis said this, and in Infinitas Dignitas, right? He says this about war, which is my parallel case. He says, with its trial of destruction and suffering, war attacks human dignity in both the short and long term. Quote, while reaffirming the inalienable right to self-defense and the responsibility to protect those whose lives are threatened, we must acknowledge that war is always a, quote, defeat of humanity, end quote. No war is without the tears of a mother who has seen her child mutilated or killed. No war is worth the loss of the life of even one human being, a sacred being created in the image and likeness of its creator. No war is worth the poisoning of our common home, and no war is worth the despair of those who are forced to have their homeland and are deprived from one moment to the next of their home and all the family, friendship, social, and cultural ties that have been built up sometimes over generations. So all wars, by the mere fact that they contradict human dignity, are, quote, conflicts that will not solve problems but only increase them. This point is even more critical in our time when it has become commonplace for so many innocent civilians to perish beyond the confines of a battlefield. Now, this almost sounds like war itself is intrinsically evil. What he's saying is war is always an affront to human dignity, but he does say that he affirms the inalienable right of self-defense and to protect those whose lives are threatened. So it seems like he is affirming just war, right? But with the acknowledgement that even in just war, human dignity is violated. So I don't know if that goes some way to understand the thought and mind of Pope Francis, but I think that's what's going on.
It's an interesting passage, right? In the sense that he thinks that something can be just yet still somehow a violation of human dignity. It is certainly interesting. Of course, I again would want to try and draw some symmetry breakers, between war and capital punishment.
Sure.
Again, traditionally capital punishment is seen as, I guess a big part of it is obviously drawing a distinction between an innocent and guilty person. But if somebody could be guilty to the extent, and this is, you have, is it Pius the 12th said that when the state disposes of an individual, the state isn't disposing of their right to life. Rather, the individual has already disposed himself of the right to life, right? That's the statement. So the question in the traditional natural law is that, what are rights? They're moral powers, and they're always balanced by duties and obligations. And clearly, I think we all hold that you can lose certain rights. I mean, as soon as you hold that, imprisonment is just, you've given up certain rights to various degrees of liberty after that. And then the question is, can that go so far through such grave offenses that you do indeed lose the right to life? Everyone wants to say, every Catholic wants to say and should say that no innocent person ever loses the right to life, for sure, right? And of course, war almost always involves the death of innocent people. And it's in that mess you can say that even if you can have a criteria for a just war, there's always going to be an affront to human dignity because there's just innocent people who are dying, right? Almost inevitably.
Right.
But with capital punishment, we want to say it's never, barring obviously certain mistakes that could happen, and that's a concern, right? It's not an innocent person who's ever dying. Yeah.
And we can grant that, Pat, I think. But but I just wanted to point out that this language, while it is strained, I don't know that in the mind of Pope Francis, always being an affront to human dignity entails that it's intrinsically evil, and that goes to the compatibility.
That is an interesting piece of evidence. I grant it. Yeah.
Okay. Now let's put that aside. I only bring that up for the sake of argument, right?
Yes, Suan wanted to hop in real quick. Go ahead, Suan. Yep.
Well, and this goes back to the reflection I gave earlier about, God was within his rights not to save us, but it would be unthinkable for him not to have done something like that, right? And so it's kind of like in this similar case. I mean, I guess, there are instances of just war where you would be in your rights to go to war, but then still there's a cost that comes with it, that still carries with it immense suffering and tragedy and so on and so forth. So I don't know. I just kind of see what I was meditating on there, what Pope Francis is saying here, as also connected in a sense.
Yeah.
And let me just, again, my position, and I know we all start out with, like, I don't think any of us have a totally settled position. I said where I leaned. Yeah, I think even though I lean towards a traditional view that it's morally illicit, I don't particularly have a view on the prudential matter of it. And there, I'm happy, of course, to think with the church if indeed this is read as a prudential decision. I have no issues, on those lines. So that's about all I have to say about that. So yeah, please continue.
Let me see if I can take you along here, Pat, into what I'm thinking. And so it goes back to, I will grant that the primary end of capital punishment is the punishment of a wrongdoer, lex talionis. It's a restoration of justice by means of giving the just deserts to the evildoer. I think that's correct. And I think there are also secondary ends. Those secondary ends involve and are explicitly stated by Thomas Aquinas, that they're performed for the common good, and that they are performed for public safety. Those are secondary ends. Now, this is where the question gets a little sticky, right? It seems that the papal arguments since at least Pope St. John Paul II onward have been that the circumstances of history have developed to a point, given our technology, that the penal systems that we now have permit people to be incarcerated and maybe even rehabilitated in a way that restores public safety. That's a factual claim we could dispute, and it might not always be the case. Civilizations rise and fall, and maybe that's an overestimation of the popes. It's why I don't think it's a matter of faith, but a determination that one could justly dispute with the popes. But the popes teach that, in their estimation, public safety can be protected without the death penalty in today's circumstances. My claim would be that when you obviate those secondary ends, at least in this case, it might affect the species of the act. Now, why would that be? Well, the secondary ends of capital punishment, which itself is a secondary precept, go right to the primary precepts of the common good, its safety and protection, the protection of life and the preservation of life. Those are primary precepts. So you can see the secondary ends of a secondary precept actually are grounded themselves in the primary precept. And there's a sense in which, in this case, as I said, you derive the secondary precept from the primary. And what I'm seeing here, or what I detect, is when you obviate the secondary ends that are grounded in the primary precept, you undercut the very logic by which the secondary precept was derived in the first place. Now, someone like Dr. Feser, I don't want to speak for him, he might say, well, still the primary end is what specifies the action. And that is true. However, in the case where it's inextricably linked, secondary ends are still essential to an act, and they can be dispensed with by God, as in the case of polygamy, where it was dispensed. The secondary ends of marriage go to mutual help and so forth, and those were dispensed by God and allowed. Those secondary ends were dispensed with. So polygamous marriages were actually considered permissible. Today, if someone married multiple wives, the Catholic Church would call that adultery and say, because you violated the act which had these secondary ends. Yes, marriage is for the propagation of children. And in certain historic times, that became necessitated due to scarcity of males or something like that, that men might take up multiple wives. That was sort of the justification back in the day. But it really shows that the secondary ends matter. And I think in this case, the secondary ends serve as a logical bridge to the primary precepts, and therefore almost ground what the act is in a way that when circumstances remove that secondary end of capital punishment, the action ceases to even have its primary end, which is retribution and punishment. Instead, it becomes what I would call revenge, or it's grounded in this wanting to harm the criminal. And the justification for that, then that's where dignity comes in. That's where dignity reemerges. And that point that Thomas Aquinas makes, going back again to that Ezekiel response, right? Let's go back to that for a moment and say, where is this? Sorry. So much going on here, right? This is where he says, look, this is also does human justice imitates according to its powers, puts to death those who are in danger to others, while it also allows time for repentance for those who sin without grievously harming others. I think what we could say the popes are saying is, given the circumstances and given the dignity of humans, it is now an act of hatred to cut off someone's life before they can repent, before they can bring themselves to God. And that is why they've condemned it. And I think I think that would be consistent with even saying this is a distinct species of act that is now not just inadmissible, but intrinsically evil. In other words, whenever a state does such a thing, it does so where the ends aren't properly ordered to the common good, to the good itself. It is no longer divinely authorized, and therefore the state can't claim authorization to do it. It's just state killing, just like ISIS throwing a homosexual off the roof, which is some sort of execution, but it's not a just one, right? So those are sort of my thoughts.
Okay, Suan, you want to chime in first, or you want me to?
Well, let me just say this really quick. So one thing I was surprised by, Daniel, was like how much I can actually see our cases working together. Yours is kind of like the very refined specification of kind of what I was saying before. But when you made the statement about, at this point, the act being almost like an expression of hatred, right, of killing someone before they have the chance to repent, or even, are given a fair shot or possibility of it. Admittedly, like these types of kind of, I mean, I don't know if you would characterize your argument this way, but like these character virtue, I don't know how to describe it exactly, the texture of the act or whatever. These arguments are more open to some of being accused of, like, kind of sounding question begging. But I think like part of, how Christ approached ethics and his moral vision involved a lot of like the virtue and the character and the texture of the act as well, and not just strict delineation of duties and rights and the calculation of, on the balance, how much pain has to be inflicted to get back what I'm owed, that sort of thinking.
Yeah. And let me just jump in before, Pat, you give me some trouble. Which is, here are some of the virtues of my proposal. I think it allows us to say unhesitatingly and embrace all the evidence that Dr. Feser musters that the church has been correct, that authorized state killing for the protection of the common good has its primary ends towards punishment, is perfectly morally licit. We can say that unhesitatingly. We can also say that Pope Francis's direction is grounded in the gospel, in human dignity, and it also reveals an authentic development in which we now see a materially similar act in a new species, as a new species emerging out of the historical circumstances we find ourselves in, of secular modern states who are fully capable of giving people all the opportunity they need to bring themselves to God. These, as I said, material elements of a sacrament, of becoming Christ, and dispensing with them like they're nothing, and treating them like, in an almost sacrilegious way, like you would take the bread and wine even before it's consecrated and throw it to dogs, right? You wouldn't do that. And with that understanding, yeah, that's evil. That's evil if you take something that's set aside to be holy, to become a saint, and treat it like it's disposable when safety has been secured. It's like in self-defense, sure, you can kill someone, but if you've subdued them and they're bound, and then you just say, well, I don't like that you tried to kill me, and you might try it again later, and then you just kill them. That's a different act, right? And so that's sort of what I'm saying. And then lastly, I just want to say that my explanation, I think, has the beauty of explaining things like Christ's further teaching on divorce, on the issue of slavery. We can see a generic form of servitude, some of which is licit, some of which is illicit. And we're specifying, given the circumstances, given our understanding of humans are not property, they're not tools, they're not to be bought and sold and treated like this for the rest of their lives. Sure, there are certain circumstances where people might have to become servants, but chattel slavery is always evil in every circumstance. And so what I'm trying to say is these aren't like contradictions in the natural law. It's that the natural law is actually more mutable in the secondary precepts than we might suppose. And so what I would then put the burden back on Pat, you, Ed Fezer, others, is to show that indeed all instances today are divinely authorized, that this is something immutable that we're talking about, and that is, in other words, circumstances can't change it, and that ultimately it just remains this divine authorization. My last counter evidence is that the Pope holds the keys, and those keys are, as Suan has so eloquently said in the past, right? What's the mood and tense that that which you bind will have been bound.
Paraphrastic, right? Future perfect passive.
Right. Meaning
Suan would know.
Yeah. When the popes operate those keys, they're talking about what's divinely authorized. Now, if human authority is derivative of divine authorization, and the popes, if they operated that key and said divine authorization ceases, that would change the species of the act, in my mind, definitively. Because now you're saying, well, it's authorized by the state. And I would say, who cares? It's not authorized by heaven because the Pope has said so.
Yeah. Certainly, I think that there's a plausible line of thought with respect to divine authorization in general. But let me, let me raise some trouble. Can I raise some trouble? So I know, first off, I do like, especially when you laid out the fruits of your theory and the virtues. I think that's always good, and that's all commendable. My biggest issue is that I think some matters with respect to this issue are almost sufficiently black and white that I don't think that those secondary considerations, at least I don't see how it would change it, right? Either somebody can really do something to merit capital punishment, right? That their sins or offenses are so grave that they have forfeit the right to life, or they haven't. And to me, that just seems like that's going to hold true regardless of whether there's an effective penal system or anything. I'm not seeing the connection between effective penal systems and whether or not, and that sufficiently changing that fact. Whether somebody really has done something to deserve this as a punishment for their crimes. Maybe I just need to think harder about it, but that's my initial hesitation. Even with the self-defense thing, I think that's interesting. But again, there's different moral powers at different levels, right? The moral powers I have are different than the moral powers of the state. I think it's right in self-defense that there can be instances where if I kill somebody, I haven't sinned, but man, my intention better not have had hatred in my heart and really wanting to kill that person, right? And if I can effectively subdue that person, I do not have the moral power to execute them, right? I don't. I agree with that. But we're not talking about the moral powers of the individual. We're talking about the moral powers of the state, right? So I think there's that difference as well. Sorry, you put a lot on the table, and
I'm sorry. Yeah, I threw a fire hose at you. I think that this would be the weakest point in my argument, which is it's always good to admit that, which is whether the obviation of the secondary ends of the precept do damage to its derivation from the primary precept.
Yeah, good. Thank you for restating it. And in this case, I'm skeptical it does, even if I could see that it could be the case in other things. But I mean, polygamy is an interesting one. And I guess here you guys can help fill in the historical details. There does seem to be a difference between, God permitting for various reasons something that is itself evil, right? Maybe it was the best or only available means to avert something worse, right? I mean, there's typical theodicy type of moves, right? Versus like saying, which maybe polygamy was, or divorce, for example, right? Versus saying that it actually wasn't, that it was at one point good, and then at some point not. And the slavery one might be helpful here, because I think this is an interesting and a genuine, authentic development, right? Is that, I mean, I don't think the church says like slavery in the broadest sense is evil. It's when certain distinctions were drawn between different forms of quote unquote slavery, right? That like, in some sense, just imprisoning someone is making them a slave, right? You're coercing them against their will. But I think we all think that that's just. Then there's indentured servitude, and there's the types of slavery that you find, back in biblical times, which was definitely like not the same as chattel slavery. And then there is chattel slavery, right? And once those distinctions were made, I think, the church not only rightfully came down against that, but actually came down like pretty firmly and pretty early against it as well. Impressively so, despite whatever abuses were still going on, at least at the level of teaching. I don't think you would have the same sort of scandal there as you would if you were to say the capital punishment was intrinsically evil. So I think it's a valiant project, Daniel. I am skeptical exactly at what you admitted is your weakest point, and whether the parallels could help to carry it through. I'm attracted to the fruits of that and the virtues that you said about it. But I won't carry on.
Can I just offer a couple of quotes?
Yeah.
And Daniel, I'd like to go after you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So one comes from, this is from the Catholic Encyclopedia, a 1910 edition on natural law. It says the secondary precepts are those whose observance constitutes to the public and private good and is required for the perfection of moral development, but is not so absolutely necessary to the rationality of conduct that it may not be lawfully omitted under some special conditions. For example, under no circumstance is polyandry compatible with the moral order, while polygamy, though inconsistent with human relations in their proper moral and social development, is not absolutely incompatible with them under less civilized conditions. And they're citing, again, this comes from Aquinas, who said, with respect to it, the principal end is ever to be borne in mind before the secondary end. Wherefore, since the good of offspring is the principal end of marriage, it behooves to disregard for a time the impediment that might arise to the secondary ends, when it is necessary for the offspring to be multiplied, because it was for the removal of this impediment that the precept forbidding the plurality of wives was framed, as stated above. So God removed the secondary end of marriage in the case of licit polygamy, but when that comes back into play, monogamous marriage is the only licit version. So that I'm trying to say that seems to be evidence in my favor that secondary ends do matter to the moral nature of an action. And I really think that this goes back to grounding, which you often talk about, Pat, that what I'm really saying is you have to see the logic of that capital punishment's a secondary precept. So it's entirely hinged not on punishment, not on its primary end, but on its derivation from the primary precepts. And my issue is, once you start severing those, by obviating those secondary ends of it, which are, I think, the grounding principle of punishment. In other words, I think punishment itself depends on there being this link back to the primary precepts. But punishment itself arises in the circumstances of human sin, right? So you can't say it's a primary precept in that sense to punish sinners and to give just deserts in that respect. It's derivative. And the concern is, once you start altering the act by saying, well, it's not really grounded in the primary precepts in the same way, I'm not saying that makes it evil, but it does seem to change the nature of the act to me. So that's my response.
Suan, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess I think Daniel, that might be Daniel's last word on his point. I can give my last word on kind of what I articulated earlier, because I mean, I think Daniel has done like an excellent job with just the philosophical precision of talking in natural law terms. And I think Daniel said this at the beginning, like I'm kind of taking this more from a theological perspective and from a biblical perspective, but obviously, like, we can bring in the natural law with that as well. I'm not denying that my view has anything to say about natural law theory. So just two things. I mean, one is that I think, Pat, you mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned something like, even if like we were to punish, I don't know, a criminal, we should avoid like having hatred in our hearts and a type of, let's say, I don't know, disordered, vicious intention while doing the act. Is that what you said?
And you have some quotes. Sorry, I should have had
Yeah.
these handy, from Pope, saying when the state executes, it should always be done with justice and prudence and et cetera and so forth. Obviously not with, Daniel mentioned revenge before, right? And certainly, certainly not that sort of attitude. So I stand by that. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so like this is kind of for me one of the turning points, because I mentioned at the end of my conversation with Vestigi that I had watched this documentary about Ted Bundy, and when it got up to the time of his execution, you had, even though like the victims, they did give their impact statements, but or the family members of the victims, I should say, but they were affected and victimized just as much in a certain sense. When you had the people outside celebrating and hooping and hollering that this guy was going to die and be electrocuted and fried. To me, there's something about that kind of rang the alarm bells. And that was kind of I don't know if it was the first, but it was a major move to kind of get me to think about, it seems like the death penalty, even for, let's say, third-party observers, a society, right? When we look at it in respect to the common good, it can also facilitate a savagery and a bloodlust within people, or can satisfy it. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing. The other thing too, Pat, is that I keep on going back to this point, and I know people are going to think I'm beating, like I'm just ringing a gong, but for me this is, it was so foundational. Like God was in his rights. He would have been totally just if he didn't save us, if he didn't go through the incarnation and sacrifice himself. But it's unthinkable, based on his nature, based on our relationship with him, the fact that he went through the trouble of putting his image on us, that he would just leave us and abandon us in our sins, even if somehow it was technically just within the relationship between, or the infinite gap between, the one who is being itself and us created essays. And so I'm thinking about when Jesus says, be perfect like your heavenly Father is perfect. And at least in the way that God the Father cashed out his actions and his treatment of us, he didn't just take into account what we deserved, but he took into consideration what would it take to redeem us and reawaken our conscience. And so, we mentioned before, like, is this a slippery slope with hell? Even a lot of people like Father Rooney, when they defend their theory of hell, they defend it on the basis of actually the punishment of hell is rehabilitative. It's just that the obstinate soul of the damned refuse help, refuse salvation, refuse to be converted. And so, there's some theologians throughout the church who have said that the fires of hell and the fires of purgatory are the same. The difference is the soul within it, whether it's purgatory or hell. So I'm not worried about like the slippery slope with hell, but I am just saying that at least if we are called to be perfect like the Father, and this is how the Father approached what was unforgivable and infinitely dishonorable to him, I think that has a bearing on what we have to do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's you guys are bringing some very good and thoughtful considerations to this, and it's going to cause me to think about it for a while.
And can I just say one last thing, Pat?
Yeah. And then
I mean, like, and here's the thing, I kind of, in a weird way, I kind of got dragged into this topic because I read Fastigi's essay and I thought, oh, this is great. I want to talk to Fastigi. And then next thing you know, I'm defending my position and weighing in on this issue. So I have no disrespect towards you or towards anybody of a different mind. I have no condescension in my heart towards anybody who disagrees. I can understand in a lot of ways why it's difficult, to accept what we're saying or even the skepticism.
Yeah,
I just want you to know. Yeah.
Oh, I know that for you, Swan. I know both of you
Yeah.
guys are great, faithful men, and that's why I was excited to have this. So let me just offer a few things, and then you guys can have the final word. The finale. So, Swan, I agree about your point about like, people should not be like having parades over execution, stuff like that. Like, I think it is a solemn thing if somebody's executed. Why? Because the whole circumstances that led up to that, or like if somebody was a serial killer, like the entire tragedy in all that is nothing that should ever, have any sort of celebrations surrounding it, even if, and I think this is the right attitude, you think that the execution was just, right? But the whole that whole of everything that led up to that execution is so tragic, right? Is so awful, and everybody that suffered that, like, there's just, I think so, right. And I do think that there are people who just have a perverted sort of bloodlust or thirst for revenge, and all of that is anti-Christian for sure. And my understanding is that even early on, when the death penalty was endorsed as more illicit, that attitude was always cautioned against. Like, we don't want Colosseum type of stuff, right? So I think that concern was always cautioned against, from my understanding. Since we're talking about shows and stuff like this, I do watch a couple popular programs every now and then. If we're going to use like shows for intuition pumps, I guess. Blue Bloods, Tom Selleck, a great American, right? There's a season finale. I'm going to get the details wrong. And essentially a man who has life in prison finds a way through his criminal organization to, continue facilitating cop murders and stuff like that and do horrific things. And the whole episode involves Selleck trying to pin this guy down for the crime, right? And it's an interesting show. The family's Catholic, but it's kind of poorly written. But anyways, it's an interesting show. Anyways, gets to the end of the episode. He finally nails the guy for the crime, and the criminal, who's just been, hardened from life in prison, kind of smirks at Selleck. He's like, what are you going to do, bro? New York doesn't have the death penalty. And Selleck says, well, luckily, this is now moved to a federal crime, and they do. And that's the end of the episode. And I just, like, in terms of like intuition pumps, I think most people say that's justice, right? This guy deserved it. It's not even about deterrence because he's still able to kill people, right? And they weren't even thinking about deterrence. But I think there's just something deeply intuitive. Unless I'm just very perverted. I got to the end of that episode, and like Selleck wasn't celebrating. He wasn't like hoopla. He just he straight up. I think it was well written. Like, this is just, you've done horrible things, right? Acts of terrorism. Continue to do horrible. Like, this is a matter of justice that you're being, and that has always been, again, I think the traditional teaching, the one that the church has taught. It's just interesting because it somewhat relates to the factual prudential thing of whether modern prison systems are actually effective or this or that. And that's not something I even want to get into about all of it. So I'll offer that just as a consideration, because I think you can look at these situations from different ways and get intuition pumps from different angles, right? I think you're right, Suan, when you look at it from people who are clearly just out for revenge and stuff, like, there's something nasty about that. That's perverse. but then you go watch the Blue Bloods episode or something like that, and you're like, no, my intuitions are now kind of moving the other way, right? And that's why morality ultimately is intuitions aren't baseless, but it's a rational enterprise at the end of the day, and that's why we have to try and engage in this sorts of natural law reasoning and look at what the church has taught and all this or that. At the end of the day, I think it's a tough. You both have given me stuff to think about. I think it's a tough thing, and I don't even really like talking about it, honestly. It's just like Daniel knows, like when I talk with him, like we're just thinking about issues in metaphysics most of the time, like nerding out on that. But I've seen so much, as I know you guys have, of just a lot of just confused thinking on this and failing to understand that the issue for Catholics here is really one of magisterial credibility, right? And that's something we all care very, very much about. Why? Because we very, very much care about our Catholic faith, not just for our own, like, look, none of us, I think, are having a crisis of faith over this, because we see that there are potential resolutions, even if we don't, agree on what they are. It's clear that you can avoid the extreme issue of falsification or stuff like that. But boy, have a lot of people who are not Catholic jumped on this one as a way to attack magisterial credibility as well. And for that reason, I think it's just really important that people understand why this is an issue that is more just beyond the question of the death penalty itself, and why it needs to be thought about carefully, because I think some takes out there are just really, really bad and miss what the wider stakes are, and essentially just give way more to Catholic critics than should be given. So that's another kind of concern of mine in the background. I've said enough, so I'll let you guys finish up with whatever you want. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess I'll jump in and just say, imagine two different endings to that show. One, he's executed for a federal crime, and they flash over to hell, and you see him burning for all eternity, being justly punished for his eternal sins. And another where the state incarcerates him, the public's safe, and over time, this person's rehabilitated, finds his way into faith, and then is sanctified and becomes a saint in heaven.
But can we reverse it too? He's executed, but he's in heaven. He lives a long life, is in hell.
Could be.
I guess the one last point. Sorry, I did want to raise this before, and then we'll do a finale. I mean, like, conversion is ultimately God's business, right? Like, God is the efficient cause of bringing people to heaven. It's not us, right?
But like, are we to give as much time as possible for God to operate, rather than us acting like, as Thomas Aquinas said, there's sometimes we should stay in execution for conversion. And the issue, under Christendom, the state had a vested interest in the salvation of the soul. The modern secular states that we live in have no vested interest.
I agree with that.
In a criminal having any particular conversion moment. So that really doesn't factor into the equation, really, when it comes to state execution.
Daniel, I was waiting for you to bring up that point.
Yeah, and that could relate to the divine authorization and the secularization of the world, and I think those are all interesting things. My only point is, like, I have these thought experiments, like, hey, if you want to help someone get to heaven, kill them right when they're baptized, right? And then you have an interesting thought experiment. Well, why don't I do that, right?
It goes back to the Phaedo. The Phaedo says we're not in possession of our own lives. Even the state doesn't possess our life. God is in possession of our life. And so when we say, well, the state can do it, yes, when it's divinely authorized to do so, and it is divinely authorized to do so, I would argue, when the security of the common good is at stake. But otherwise, the dignity of that person sort of supervenes on the matter, and it becomes a matter of trying to provide as ample opportunity for them to be saved as possible. And lastly, and then I'll let you respond. Let Swan respond. I mentioned this to my students that we're talking about. I said, I'm going to be talking about the death penalty, and the student said, "Are you for it or against it?" And I said, "Well, I'm opposed to the death penalty." And they said, "Really?" And I said, "Well, let me clarify." I said, anytime I have found myself in support of the death penalty, it's because of my passions overriding my reason. I read a story of severe child abuse and neglect, and I'm like, I hope those people are electrified, fried, and go to hell. Like, I want them damned to hell. And then I realized, oh, that was just my emotions rising up. But when I'm sober minded and thinking about it and thinking about my actual moral position, it's not what I want. But yes, you're right. You can give me dozens and dozens of examples where I will lash out with my Italian passions and just be like, I want them killed. I want them dead. But it's never been for me my rational disposition.
Yeah, interesting. We do differ there, I think, a little bit. And just last thing on the killing somebody as soon as they're baptized is this relates to what I was saying is, if somebody gets to heaven because you kill them right after baptized, like that's accidental to the act, right? What you are the efficient cause of is the destruction of an innocent nature. So that act is characterized in that way, and that's why it's always evil, it's sinful, and now you're in mortal sin, right? God is the efficient cause of bringing people to heaven, right? So again, if conversion is God's business, and the state has the right to do this, and so on and so forth, I think those are important distinctions, right? That in the way that they factor into why we aren't morally obligated to kill somebody as soon as they're baptized to get them to heaven, right? That capital punishment would still be on the table there. I think that if prudentially, right, as a matter of opportunities for conversion, I'm totally, open-minded, giving people, I do not have a settled mind on that one way or another, whether somebody seeing the hangman would be better to get them to repent, or whether they harden over time, or time is helpful, more time with a priest, or what. I think they should see a priest no matter what the option, right? For sure. Definitely some time with a priest before, I don't know. I'm not settled on that. I think those are important considerations, but they, again, are not the primary one of whether something is inherently owed, right, as a matter of punishment, first and foremost, and God ultimately being the one in charge of conversion and having a certain domain that is just not ours, right? All right, that's it. I'm really not going to say any more now. So except for goodbye. Okay. So Suan, you go ahead and help. Yeah.
We kind of ended this episode like a Baptist sermon. The pastor always says that he's got one more point, and then you got 30 minutes going.
Well, to be fair, it's because you guys keep raising great points, and when you raise great points, they make you think of more points, right? Yeah.
That's right. Well, okay, let me just say two things real quick. I mean, aside from just thank you to Pat and thank you to Daniel for the time, really. And so, I mean, one thing is that, Pat, near the end, I think you talked about slavery, and you just mentioned how, at least just in the course of history, it just became such a moral hazard and just went haywire to the point where, I mean, Phaser mentions this in his article as well, that I think he does, that like it was a just decision to say, we're just not going to practice like anything remotely like that anymore. Right. We become much more protective and cautious with anything related to that domain. And I mean, it's interesting because when I've talked about like slavery in the Bible, I've used the point that, let's say the logic of slavery in the Bible, typically, if we exclude times of war, was that, you're paying back a debt with service. But then when people default on their debts, they have to end up, being in that master's house and living maybe the rest of their days out, or I think it's like 5-year minimum. Anyway, the point is that like when you look at even the history of ancient Israel with the institution of slavery, at some point, I think when you get to the prophets, people have to start selling their children as slaves. And then I think Amos talks about like you're selling the righteous like pairs of sandals, right? Like it becomes, you give this thing an inch and it goes a mile, and it ends up having this toxic effect. Even if somehow maybe there's a very precise, pristine condition under which it's fine, typically speaking, the effect on society, the way that it does end up polluting and making things toxic as it goes on and on and on. I just kind of view the death penalty in the same way, where it's like maybe we could imagine these really pristine cases, but I'm just saying that by its nature, what it communicates to a society, what it does, the case with like the people celebrating Ted Bundy's death, I just don't think that's an accident, let's say. I think there's something about the death penalty that carries a corrosive effect on a society and people's souls. Just like slavery, ended up going, you gave it an inch and it goes a mile. And the next thing you know, people are selling their kids as slaves. So that's one thing. Now, the thing I want to really close on, There's this quote by Robert F. Kennedy, the senator, not the current RFK, where after Martin Luther King was assassinated, he has this beautiful line where he says at the end, to prevent people from rioting, to address and to share his empathy with people. He says, "Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world." And even though he attributes that to the Greeks, I mean, that's essentially what I view as the Christian ethic. And so that's just something that I've lived with ever since I heard that speech.
Good, good. Okay, well, this has been very great, very fruitful, and I want to thank you guys for both coming here with lots of good thoughts, and I'm sure this will encourage a lot more thought and conversation. Certainly, I hope that people will think about this issue carefully, and if nothing else, hopefully we've helped to provide a framework of how to think about it, if nothing else, and why it's an important conversation to have. So before we say goodbye, Daniel, Suan, just to do some announcements. What are you guys working on? Where can people keep up with you and your work? And let's finish with that. Yep.
Working with you on a few projects.
Indeed, we are. Yeah.
So hopefully we'll get some of those out, but we're working on a few metaphysical stuff. I only touch the ethical stuff when I have to, because you don't want to screw up there. You can screw up metaphysics and logic, but if you screw up ethics,
all day long, right? Yeah, it's a good point, right? Yeah. Cool. Yeah, and hopefully we'll have some announcements about it. I mean, Daniel and I have done a number of papers, and they've been in the peer review pipeline for a while now, but we'll see. Suan, what about you?
Yeah, so as you all know, probably, I'm working as the director of apologetics for the Diocese of Bridgeport under Bishop Frank Caggiano, and I've been loving my job. I've been working with high schools and parishes. I've been giving a lot of theology talks. I've been very impressed with the high school students in this diocese. I was having a conversation with one young man about whether or not he liked the Summa Contra Gentiles or the Summa Theologica more, and this guy's a freshman in high school. So there are some really strong minds out here. I'm so excited to play my part and sharing the faith. And, I'm very unapologetic about what we believe as Catholics and helping young people to have the confidence to affirm what we believe, about all issues ranging from life to marriage to the Our Lady and so on and so forth. So I think Daniel and I were working on this paper on the death penalty. We're going to work on that. I think next month is when we're really going to break ground on it. Aside from that, I'm presenting a paper actually at the American Catholic Philosophical Association conference at the end of this month, beginning of next month, with Father James Dominic Rooney. So we're going to look at his book on dogmatic authority.
Oh, cool.
And I have my own paper where I actually defend the Protestant position. So I play Protestant's advocate. I don't believe it, but I'm playing the advocate just for fun.
Yeah. That's good. That's good, right? As we are doing here, pressure testing, right? Yeah. Awesome. Well, yeah, we'll keep an eye out for that. Where's that conference this year, Suan?
University of Notre Dame. So I'm also going to talk to some biblical studies faculty there, see if I can, do something with them in the future.
Oh, very cool. All right. Hey, appreciate you guys a lot. Appreciate everyone who is listening to this. Chime in, of course, to the comments section. Just keep it respectful, keep it civil, keep it thoughtful, and check out Swan's channel, Intellectual Catholicism, and we'll catch you guys next time.